You've definitely heard the story of Tulip Mania, right? This wild tale of fortunes made and lost all over a single flower? But what if I told you the story you think you know isn't really the truth? Today, we're going to peel back the layers on one of history's most legendary financial bubbles. So stick around, because what we find is pretty surprising. And hey, if you love digging into the real story behind the myths, do me a favor and hit that like and subscribe button.
So, the legend paints this incredible picture of 17th century Holland just gripped by a kind of collective madness. According to this famous account by Charles Mackay, literally an entire nation, from the richest nobles all the way down to chimney sweeps, was swept up in this insane frenzy for tulips.
The story gets even crazier. We're told the speculation got so intense that a single flower bulb could be traded for a mansion. Fortunes were supposedly made in the morning and lost by the afternoon, leading to a massive crash that ruined thousands and just shattered the Dutch economy. It's an amazing story, but is it true?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. What if this epic story, the one that's been told for centuries, is actually mostly a myth? Because as you're about to see, the real story is way more complex and honestly a lot more fascinating than the legend.
First things first, to get what really happened, we have to understand the tulip itself. You see, back in the 1630s, this was not just some flower you'd pick up for your garden. It was brand new, it was exotic, and it was this powerful symbol of wealth and status, especially during the booming Dutch Golden Age.
And here's the thing, the most valuable tulips were these things called broken tulips, and their incredible flame-like patterns weren't from some master gardener. Nope, it was actually a virus. This virus made each flower's pattern totally unique and unpredictable, turning every single bulb into a rare, one-of-a-kind piece of living art.
And at the very top of this flower pyramid was the one, the only, the legendary Semper Augustus. With these brilliant red flames shooting across a pure white background, it was the absolute holy grail. Owning one of these wasn't about gardening, it was a screaming declaration that you were at the top of the social food chain.
Now, to give you a sense of the kind of value we're talking about, one really famous story claims that a single bulb of another rare tulip was traded for all this stuff you see here. The total value? Over 2,500 florins. To put that in perspective, that's more than 10 times what a skilled craftsman earned in an entire year. The numbers are just staggering.
Okay, so the prices for these super rare bulbs were, without a doubt, incredibly high. But the story of a nationwide economic collapse that followed, well, this is where the myth starts to completely fall apart when you look at the actual historical records.
So let's bust myth number one, that everyone was trading tulips. Digging through the archives, historians like Anne Goldgart found that, nope, this wasn't some national obsession. It was actually confined to a pretty small, tight-knit group of rich merchants and skilled artisans, not, the general public.
As historian Anne Goldgart puts it, the shock of what happened was huge, but the actual direct financial hit, pretty limited. The story got so big because of its massive cultural impact, not because of some widespread financial disaster.
And what about that devastating crash that supposedly left thousands destitute? Again, the records tell a very different story. Researchers have only found evidence of maybe fewer than a dozen bankruptcies that were actually tied to the tulip trade. And the Dutch economy? Far from collapsing, it stayed the powerhouse of Europe for like another 100 years.
So you're probably asking, how could prices crash so hard without bankrupting everyone? Well, the answer is in how they were trading. It was called windahandel, which literally means wind trade. And that's because people weren't really trading physical flower bulbs. They were trading contracts for bulbs that would be delivered in the future, bulbs that were still in the ground. So here's what happened. When the market finally did collapse in February 1637, the government basically stepped in. They passed a rule that turned these ironclad contracts into something more like today's stock options. Buyers could just walk away from their deals if they paid a small penalty, about 3.5% of the contract price. So instead of going bankrupt, most traders just paid a small fee and walked away. The crisis was stopped in its tracks, and very few fortunes were actually lost.
Okay, so if this wasn't really a story about mass greed and economic catastrophe, what was actually going on here? Well, the answer has a lot less to do with money and a lot more to do with the deep anxieties of the Dutch Republic in the 17th century.
You have to remember what was happening at the time. The Dutch were a brand new country, born out of a brutal 80-year war. Their whole society was shaped by a very strict form of Calvinism that taught that wealth was a sign of God's blessing, but that moral screw-ups would lead to divine punishment.
Add in a terrifying outbreak of the plague right before this, and you've got a society simmering with tension and uncertainty.
And that's why the real damage from the tulip crash wasn't financial, it was social. This was a crisis of trust, a crisis of honor.
See, their whole society was built on credit, on reputation, on your word being your bond. So when all of a sudden people just started breaking their contracts, it was a massive shock. These were deals made with neighbors, with friends, even with family. It felt like the very moral fabric of their world was tearing apart. That was the real crisis.
So, this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. If the huge economic crash was basically a myth, why on earth does the legend of this catastrophic bubble live on so strongly today? The answer is simple. It was a story that people at the time really needed to tell.
The dramatic tale of ruin and madness was, for all intents and purposes, propaganda. It was created and spread by religious pamphleteers right after the market turned south. They saw this wind trade in flowers as a sign of ungodly greed, and they used the story to warn people about what happens when society loses its moral compass.
And this moral tale was just so good, so compelling, that almost 200 years later, it was picked up by a Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay. His account was sensational, it was dramatic, and it was mostly inaccurate. But it's his version of the story from 1841 that became famous and is still quoted all the time today. And that really explains why the legend is so powerful. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the dot-com bubble, the 2008 housing crisis, or the wild swings in crypto and NFTs, the myth of Tulip Mania is the perfect, timeless cautionary tale about the dangers of speculation, even if the original story isn't actually true.
So that leaves us with this final, fascinating thought. The enduring legend of Tulip Mania probably says a lot more about our own modern fears of financial bubbles and economic collapse than it does about what actually happened in 17th century Holland. It kind of makes you wonder, right? What cautionary tales are we creating for ourselves right now?
Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into history. I really hope you found that as fascinating as I did. If you enjoyed getting to the bottom of the real story, please don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more explainers just like this one. I'll see you in the next one.